Okay. Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're both audible and visible.
Okay, perfect. The belief that a relationship escalator will guarantee you happiness is a lie that we do not want to buy into. I want to be clear. It is not our burden to defend one specific kind of deviation, but that they should be able to choose to deviate in general. In fact, it is Op's burden to prove why it is this one singular path of following a relationship escalator that is the best path and is therefore worth any kind of trade-off with your own self-development or your ability to explore what your preference truly are and therefore make a more informed decision when you choose to follow, when you choose to like settle down, when you choose to therefore have a family. I want to be clear about the frame. One, let's talk about the world that Gen Z lives in and why it is uniquely different. First of all, we would say it's a highly changing and globalizing world. Insofar as, regardless of where you are in the world, the touch of a button means you can talk to other people with different cultures and narratives and beliefs, and therefore learn from other people's experiences and also choose what kind of values fit for you. Second, it is technological advancements at a lightning rate, which means that this generation was born in a world in which like mobile phones were not normal, and now is a world in which you can find the love of your life with the click of a button. But third, that the relationship escalator was created like most notably in a world without any of this technology and any of this kind of globalization. And so the only reason it prevails is because it is pushed and funneled by older generations who have opted into it. But if you look at these older generations, it is oftentimes not the case that they have found true happiness, because you still have high divorce rates, you still have many women being beaten, you still have people only realizing after being married for 30 years that they're actually gay. Next, who is this Gen Z individual? One, they're likely to be raised with more 21st century values, which look like highlighting individuality, exploring your preferences, and not necessarily conforming to the world in which your parents likely conform to. But this also looks like narratives that tend to be anti-relationship escalator. Because note that the relationship escalator came as a result of the Bible, came as a result of very right-wing conservative institutions that said you ought to do it this way. And what this means is, given the values of this Gen Z individual who is likely to be more progressive, care about women empowerment, care about being about the LGBT community, and might actually be LGBT, that is why they're very different. But finally, what does it mean to deviate? It's not just to impose a standard. One, it is to not impose a standard that you ought to follow this relationship escalator, but it also means doing things in a different order or opting out of some things entirely. So maybe it's fine to have kids without getting married. Maybe you don't want to have kids. Maybe you don't want to get married, or maybe you want to get married but not have sex. And these are all things that are all equally as valid in your choice. But we would suggest as well, you are likely to do this smartly. Because fun, especially for matters of sex and relationships, there are lots of nuanced narratives that tell them what to do. So you have, for example, narratives that have a greater emphasis on individuality or your career, or very large narratives that tell you to use protection or birth control. And this comes from media specifically shifting cultural tendencies that notably other generations did not have access to. And note that many of these narratives are funneled either by peers or older people whose experiences are more proximate than a Gen Z's parents, maybe millennials, etc. But the second reason is that they will individually turn away from anything they don't want to, which we would suggest is an arguably better gauge for what they are doing rather than archaic, bigoted, alt-right charged expectations of what a relationship should be and how it ought to form. Before my first argument, I'll take that POI.
So what does deviating mean? Do you stay on the first level? Do you jump to the last level immediately? Can you clarify that a little bit more?
I just explained it. Listen to my speech. It is, you can do anything that does not follow the order. You can skip some steps. You can, I don't know, get married first and touch later, whatever it is you want, as long as it's not in the order said in the info slide. Listen to me. Argument one then. You will be happier when you deviate. First, why is a relationship escalator necessarily toxic and inherently confining for this individual. First of all, right-wing institutions have a monopoly over how it manifests. So this looks like the Bible and religious institutions, Project 2025, or American traditionalism that all tell you that you ought to do this because it's the way things have always been. And what this means is the types of discussions and forums, the things you hear, are oftentimes really bad at informing your decisions because it's only by one specific way that is oftentimes formed by an opinion and a worldview that is not the world you currently live in. But second, it is built on patriarchy and heteronormative values, which means a big part of exploring your sexuality and finding what you like relies on you perhaps being able to sexually explore out of the confines of the step-by-step relationship escalator. Maybe you want to have sex to realize whether or not to confirm whether or not you are bisexual because you think that that's one way in which you can therefore be and live more authentically. Or maybe it is a fact that you as a woman want to express yourself more sexually, even if these heteronormative values tell you not to. It is the relationship escalator that controls you. But third, a lot of things that the relationship escalator requires you to make creates a massive personal cost. For example, getting married means you have to dedicate your entire life to this individual without seeing anyone else. Oftentimes, for example, having to wait until marriage means you cannot realize if you are sexually compatible and therefore live in a sexless and unhappy marriage. And these are all things we think make you unhappy. The impacts are simple. One, you were unable to explore gender and sexuality. And that is why you've historically seen, for example, many married men only realizing today that they are gay or coming out because of the strong narratives that exist in the Gen Z space. So harms exist, not only to you, but when your uninformed or unexplored decisions therefore lead to other people making the same large, massive sacrifice to get married to you, to dedicate their entire life for you, and therefore end up being left in the dust when you realize your true authentic self way too late. We do not want that to happen to this individual and the people who they likely love or care about or will be touching in their lives, so we would rather this not happen. But second, you feel pressure to follow a certain progression, which is worse because you are ill-informed, which means that at the point in which you opt into this progression, it's hard for you to discern whether or not what you are experiencing is something that is good, is something that makes you happy because you do not really have much of a comparison point. Why, therefore, in comparison, deviation is better? One, there are a lot more opportunities to fill in your own preferences, whether or not you want to have sex now, whether or not you want to have sex in general, whether or not you want to be gay or be straight or realize that is yourself. But second, that's also what most other Gen Z people opt into because existing in these spaces validate these choices for you because many of those other Gen Z individuals are on Tinder or on Bumble. So even if your family does not understand, it is your peers and friends who affirm this decision. But also, social media chronicling of experiences oftentimes create a library of stories that fills the gap in times in which parental experience and advice is not enough or applicable to you. And the final thing is more optionality with who you date and when you do that. Why is this debate winning? We are agnostic as to what the ideal timeline for the Gen Z individual is, but the only thing we know is whenever we go through experiences, we end up having more parts of ourselves that we can use to therefore make informed decisions about what to commit to long term. And secondly, as a Gen Z person who has likely been brought up with ideas of individuality, feeling pressure and an inability to change is likely to be something you do not want at all costs because you believe that is inherent oppression. The conclusion is simple. Neither side can approximate what the outcome can be, but what is assured is you can explore and therefore make more informed decisions in our world.
Thank you for that fine speech, Prime Minister. To introduce the class from UP, calling on Audrey here.
Hello. I'll just set up my timer. Give me a minute. UI through voice. Wait. UI through voice. I don't see chat. Excuse me. 3, 2, 1. I think government tries to give a really weird clash and they're making us defend some absurd stuff because the vast majority of their pushes against our case is that we have to defend a right-wing version of what dating should be. So number one, if I am able to disprove that no, the dating escalator isn't right-wing in nature, the first half of their speech ends. But secondly, if I'm able to prove that the order of that escalator and not exactly the end outcome is what we should be defending, that deals with the second half of your speech. Let's respond. First, let's deal with the whole right-wing patriarchy thing because Nessie tells us that the relationship escalator has roots in the patriarchy, so we as Gen Z shouldn't support it. This is untrue. First, a lot of things have roots in the patriarchy, the military, education, the finance sector, yet we still do things like that. But next, understand that the interpretation of this Gen Z individual is not likely to be right-wing in nature, given their mechanisms. And if you read the info slide carefully, it shows that you can have sex before marriage because the order is dating, getting to knowing, maybe kissing, maybe sex, and then marriage. So the end outcome isn't you need to have sex after marriage. Because if this was right-wing, then sex would be the end of the list and end of the escalator, but it just isn't. The point of the
EOI.
escalator then therefore is that the important facet and the important mechanism for relationships is that the order has to have a certain progression. That before you can advance the physical intimacy that is very, very intense, you have to have a distinct emotional connection with the other person in order to trust them more, in order to ensure that you won't get hurt at the end of the day. Second, they try to say that, so this proves that it isn't right wing. Next, they try to say that you can't really explore anything and you can't be gay for some reason. This is just untrue. I'm gonna flip this because in our side of the house, I'm going to argue to you that when you focus on that escalator, when you focus more on finding a connection first, that is the best time to explore. Because when you're exploring, when you're already entangled in physical intimacy, that's gonna be significantly harder to opt out it. But before my argumentations, go. POA.
So we didn't say that relationships have roots in patriarchal systems, therefore we should oppose it. That's a straw man. But rather that patriarchal systems often have irreversibly large holds over what the conception of this is.
If you just said that the Gen Z isn't likely to buy into it, why would they buy into it then? Right. What's the context that they have to debate in? Number one, the problem is that the vast majority of individuals in the Gen Z sector, so Gen Z dating culture is really, really toxic. 3 mechanisms as to why this is true. Number one, you have the prominence of things like situationships and unclear labels when you aren't sure if you are fully committed or you can talk to other people. That causes a lot of distress and heartache. Number two, you have bad narratives like the I can fix him narrative that's prominent in places like TikTok or BookTok or Colleen Hoover that encourages these people to date terrible people because, you can probably fix them. Third, this probably means that there are unreconcilable values and differences that just don't get reconciled because when you don't initially know them, you don't like when you get into a situationship, the other person might interpret it as being an open situationship, but you might think it's a closed situationship, ending in a lot of heartbreak and fights. The conclusion to this is that in their side of the house, when they're defending the current toxic method or the current toxic nature of Gen Z relationships, so the prominence of things like hookups, situationship, and things like even things like getting married early is significantly worse on their side. Because here's how the implementation of the escalator is really going to be and what they have to what they have to respond to in deputy. Because what does this look like in our side of the house? Number one, this probably means the gradual nature of relationships as a whole. So a lot of Gen Z, so this Gen Z actor in particular is less likely to rush into various situationships. They are more likely to go on dates first and to talk to them first and to get to emotionally know them before opting into things like sexual intercourse and other things. Second, it also gives you a greater chance to opt out to it in the first place because when you have more time to give yourself the opportunity to get to know this person, if by the end of this time, no. If by the end of your the next week, for example, this person is a terrible person and is boring, you can still opt out without having committed anything. But thirdly, so the importance and conclusion of this is all that it is important that the emotional trust is way, way, way more important before you get to physical connections. Why is this true? Number one, understand when you opt into physical connections, so fuck buddies, for example, there's a distinct, it's significantly harder for them to opt out in their side of the house. Why? Having sex increases the dopamine levels and it hinders your rationality as an individual. It makes you make worse decisions because the appeal of having sex with this person will probably override any rational thought. That's why. Yeah. Next argumentation then on the interest of the actor and why you as an actor probably don't like the current state of this toxicity and want emotional stability. Key features here. Number one, you as an actor has probably either has first-hand experiences on the toxicity of the current dating pool or dating culture.
EOI.
So you've probably been in these situationships. You've probably had hookup cultures. You've had people who ghosted you. You've had people who semi-cheated on you because you didn't know what the label of it was. Number two, you probably have other friends who've went through the same heartbreak. And number three, you probably consume a lot of media that talks about the heartbreak and relationship of these things. Implications then are very simple. You are still an average individual, so you don't want these things happening to you again. You've probably personally felt hurt. You've probably been cheated on. You've probably been betrayed. You're sad, and you've probably questioned your self-worth as an individual. Am I ugly? Am I smart? Am I too fat? Things like that. The impacts that are better in our side for four specific reasons. Number one, in our side of the house, when you pivot to the relationship escalator, you actually get more knowledge and information in our side of the house. Because what they try to say is that, the patriarchy controls the narrative on dating, for example. This is just out
POI.
There's a significant amount of younger couples and Gen Z people, like, I don't know, the Obamas, for example, who had a traditional marriage escalator, and they seem to have a nice marriage life at the end of the day, right? Number two, you still get the choice to choose, but it's more gradual. Number three, you are more likely, if you get a partner, that your values are going to be aligned and they're going to be better at the end of the day. And lastly, because you don't have to deal with all these harms, you get more emotional stability at the end of the day. And the conclusion of this argument is to just prove that it's in the interest of the actor to opt out, because the actor is probably tired of the toxicity of Gen Z dating culture. Now, last point then, on why this is better, because it helps you build resilience and patience for your other tasks in life. The urgency is very simple. The problem with the constant current state of Gen Z dating right now is that things are too rushed. People are rushing in to get into situationships because they think that this might be my future boyfriend, that they're going to take the risk and take the chance in this hookup because they might turn out to be a great person at the end of the day. In opposition, it is significantly better installed in our side of the house for a couple of mechanisms. Number one, because the gradual nature of the relationship escalator, you are more likely to be content with being single for now, because you know that in the future it probably might go for you. It might go your way, but you are more wary and you don't want to have to go through all that heartbreak at the end of the day. So you're more cautious and you're less likely to get into these toxic situationships and for you to get hurt at the end of the day. The impacts of this are very, very simple. Number one, you get better internal expectations because you have more time to think on what you really want in a partner. What are your specific red flags? What are your specific interests? You are less likely to settle for the bare minimum or even less than that. But secondly, you also get more better external expectations. You are a better judge of character if this person is just love bombing you or if they're a genuinely nice person. In conclusion, this is significantly better because relationships aren't everything. And the problem with current Gen Z dating is that you rush into it with the relationship escalator and probably waiting and being more cautious. You aren't likely to rush in. You can save yourself from all the heartbreak. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech. I'll also extend the case of Gov calling on DPM. Here.
Okay, I am visible and audible, I presume. I'll just put my laptop to the side. Could I get a confirmation?
Yes, you are. You're audible and visible.
All right. POIs in chat. I won't take them if you give it through voice. I'll also be 4-6. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is telling that its opposition team already loses because they rely on a false dichotomy. You obviously have incentives to know people, and if you like that person, you will get with them on either side. But it's very flimsy when the way their first speaker tries to confuse this debate as well. They assume that our entire first case, or the entirety of Nessie's speech, is hinged on the assumption that this is right-wing, therefore bad, and therefore that's the only reason why we oppose this. But note, even though they say the Gen Z person will interpret this as progressive and can pick and choose away patriarchal stuff as part of this, despite the fact that our POI and many of our framing explains that it's often right-wing institutions or conservative narratives or norms in that society, whether it's your family or religions, etc., that set and can control these narratives, despite the fact that we frame this and there's a literal assertion from their side of the house that you can get away from this. I want to note this is very, very killer for their first speaker to concede. Because if you say you're progressive and you will still opt into the relationship escalator, you will literally kill most of the validation and support systems you will get on their side. It's things such as your family still not accepting you because you're not part as much as what religion or the part or, for example, of believing in the institution of marriage, etc. on their side of the house. You just coincidentally follow this. You don't get the fulfillment from narratives in that media, etc. You don't get the support from friends that are also more likely hardline into this narrative on your side of the house, which is why even if you get this individual fulfillment, you don't get fulfillment from other people or support in your decisions, which is a very, very important part insofar as Gen Z people often rely on other people and often they are very, very more likely to, rely and get fulfillment from other people in that sense. So they already killed their case from that. You cannot just assume a man is an island, a man requires other people. You alienate most of the narratives that validate you on their side of the house. I have 3 responses before I go into the extension on the long term. Firstly, they say the traditional path gets you better and more stable relationships. Their first mechanism here is that you're more likely to know this person first because you follow this. The first response to this is that obviously my intro is true, which is that if you go into this and relationships especially, if you like a person, right, you're more likely to get information about that person, etc. But secondly, etc. Because you like that person, you want to spend time with them. On our side of the house, it isn't just though that you go into marriage. You could probably live in with that person, or you, for example, can explore different things with that person without defining as traditional and part of the path. Versus on their side of the house, the incentive is just to go into marriage, so the outcome is the same either way. It's not a big part of the debate. But secondly, I would flip this actually in most of the cases on their side. Just because you're on the traditional path, that's why you're more likely to skip and ignore information about this person. Why? One, because you often have pressure from your family that when you become 23 or 25, you get married, which is why even if you see red flags on that particular person and you're more like, you in that particular workspace that you have and you're referred to that person, you're more likely to still get into a relationship with them and still causes problems for you in the long term because you're willing to overlook that. But two, it's the fact that the amount of preferences that you're able to form before you get into the relationship is significantly less on their side, which is why the ability for you to be informed on what you want and what don't want is significantly less. You don't often know, and we're agnostic to the preferences of this average Gen Z person. But the fact of the matter is, their side has net less experiences because they just get into net less relationships, or often choose or whatever they want in different kinds of traditional, non-traditional structures. Which means that at minimum they will have less knowledge on their side of the house, or they will ignore knowledge, which leads to things like insecurity and breakups later on. But thirdly, and here's the nuance, here's the even if, right? Even if there are less breakups on their side and you get into a better relationship, we explain even in the relationship escalator, this can be bad. Because the fact is, you are still in a Gen Z environment. You have other Gen Z peers that are more likely to be flexible. Even if you are happy and healthy in a marriage in a short term, many traditional people go into the workforce in a happy family at 25. They see their co-workers go with a hot broad or whatever, and they get insecurity in their brains. This is often the source of marital unhappiness, infidelity, the fact that you feel that you've committed for far too long. And this is how I flip this. This is what creates often this pressure, because you exist in other people who are often your age group, which means that you're more likely to be insecure, you're more likely to feel unfulfilled in that. The second claim they give is you're going to be single and that's okay. Number one, this is just contradictory, right? For most people, they cannot afford to be single for until 30 because you're already off the path. The path expects you to be married first, very, very early. But secondly, just being single also doesn't get a lot of your benefits either on your side of the house. The benefits come from being on the marriage path, having children, etc. So you cannot just say this and say you can symmetricize the debate. You have to take the hard line on your side. My extension is assuming their side gets fulfillment from marriage, or the Gen Z gets fulfillment from marriage on either side or from these particular long-term structures, and says it's better under our side if we have more preferences and more time to experiment. Before I go into the extension, I'll take the POI.
So, will parents suddenly stop pressuring you to get married immediately in your side of the house as well, even if you don't follow the marriage escalator?
Here's the weighing. It's the pressure to conform to your structures on your side versus the pressure of having to constantly be unstable. Maybe it's on either side of the house, there is some degree of pressure. But we assume that when we're more likely to concede that the pressure of your family forcing you to conform is likely to significantly lessen in the future, given that you're a Gen Z person, you can validate yourself with other narratives that say it's okay not to conform, versus the pressure of always having to be in a marital structure and ignoring the problems of your spouse, ignoring the problems of your family that's being toxic towards you. That's more likely to weigh into the future, given that other counter narratives expose you to the idea that something else could be better, which is why on weighing you prioritize our characterization than theirs. Let's explain. Even in the long term on their side, where you assume marriage is good, it's worse for these people if you don't choose the deviate from the relationship structure. Why is this true? Number one, you're more likely to be secure on our side of the house when you make a decision to marry. Why? Because one, you just don't feel like you're missing out from other people's experiences, and number two, you just get less insecurity from this. It's the fact that you don't think that your young coworker had just more experiences than you when you got married very, very early, and you go older in the workforce, for example. You don't feel insecure in that decision. When you make a decision to get married, even if you're at 30 or 35, you're more likely to be secure in that, feel fulfilled from that, and most securely, you're more willing to to commit to that and find love in that partner. But two, just clearly, we have more resources on our side. Maybe we engage in some degree of non-monogamy or like sleeping around or whatever, but it's fine because it means we don't have the commitment of being in a marriage, which costs a lot of money, by the way, nowadays. Or, for example, buying a house or having children, which costs a lot of money nowadays for example, women in that. So you're more likely to have resources, advance your career, given that you don't have a lot of the opportunity costs from these things. But three, you just have more of a well of experiences. And this is the crucial nuance to the extension. Having a lot of relationships and even breakups is preference creating. You often don't know what you want if you are, for example, always going to feel within these structures happy or order or conformity. Often this makes us suppress what we want. Often it suppresses our ability to know what we can, for example, pursue in that life and be happy in that life. So now we have a well of experiences that says, maybe marriage is not okay for me, maybe it is. In the worst case that it is in this debate, you're more likely to make that decision and say, it's good for me. I don't regret it. At your deathbed, you feel fulfillment from that decision. You feel love in your wife and your children. That is very, very good because many children are born in loveless marriages, and that's a terrible thing in this debate. We prefer a Gen Z to explore first before doing the plunge into the deep on their side of the house. For those reasons, then propose.
Thank you for that fine speech, DPM. Now let's call on DLO to extend the clash coming from Audrey here.
Hello, POS through voice. Teacher, I'll use this.
Yeah.
Sorry, wait. Sorry, I got water. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Generation Z is suffering from an epidemic of sadness, high rates of loneliness, and a frustrated generation because many of their romantic interests are not fulfilled under the model of government bench. The solution is not to deviate from a clear progression of romance, but rather see the benefits to it and tailor it to a lot of your preferences, which gives you a lot of choice and even leverage to begin with. The first thing that I want to attack on their end is to explain why even if we agree that the world of the Gen Z is just generally different, and that's true, the world is not always the best fit for a lot of your interests, often pernicious. They say that you have many other alternatives and many infinite choices out there, but I think that that heightens a lot of the harms coming from their side of the house, that it's often confusing, it feels uncertain, it feels irreconcilable to a lot of the things that you want in life, given the fact that you probably do want a stable relationships, do want stable support system from your romantic interests. If they say that on their side of the house, which is the DPM's own word, is that you often don't know what your best interest is and therefore you must explore, I think the narratives on their side of the house captures these types of people even more, that many dating magazines and online dating experience tell you to go to one person to another without inherently investing and ensuring that you have good emotional compatibility with a lot of these types of people. Your characteristics as a Gen Z won't necessarily disappear just because you opt into an escalator or a progression of romance. I think number one, on individuality, you can express it through things like dating, things like communicating your preference early on before you opt into things like a situationship, which is, by the way, more prominent and more dominant in government's world, which I think is more pernicious and makes people a lot more lonelier and more frustrated with themselves, given the fact that we don't necessarily put a premium on your emotional capacity to opt into that specific relationship, versus on our side of the house, we sift through the bullshit of other individuals that makes you and pressures you to have sex early on, or more disproportionately affect women that are likely going to be subjugated towards things like situationships or open relationships where they don't necessarily feel comfortable with. There's always a power imbalance, which is often the qualms of a lot of Gen Z individuals with the dating culture that we have as of today. The second thing that they claim is that, what if you were gay and now you can opt out because now you have to be stuck here? I think number one, on our side of the house, you can still be gay, by the way. So before lesbian couples have sex, they go on like an average of 5 dates before saying that she's my girlfriend in opposition's world, versus on their side of the house, by the way, the statistical phenomenon for most lesbian relationships is that in one date they already move in together and they get married after 6 months, which, by the way, takes a lot of resources on things like divorce or even your emotional capacity to even opt out of that relationship because you already jumped ahead, which, by the way, is their own specific model that they support on their side of the house. And if we agree that it is likely that people can jump ahead, I think that is a worse off comparative on their side of the house. The last thing that they claim on PM is that their support system is something that's going to be shit, given that you're not exploring really well. I think number one, many female friendships offer a lot of support and offer a lot of advice. If the Gen Z that we're characterizing as of today as the actor is someone who is inherently progressive, they probably have also good progressive friendships. So therefore, your choice of you opting into an escalator relationship won't necessarily result to you being shamed or being embarrassed about it. I think the conclusion of this specific response is to explain that given that PM does not outline what the majority of Gen Z do, they just said it can be anything. I think that means that infinite of choices means that there's an infinite amount of harm on their side of the house. We're just unsure what is the benefit that you claim on your end, or why is it likely, versus our side of the house, there's a clear pattern of what you want in a relationship. I think number one, it increased the frequency of your heartbreak on government's world. If PM claims that it's okay for you to jump to marriage, that means that the harms coming from government, that DPM, means that a lot of it results to things like a massive amount of expense, because now you have to opt out after a year of marriage, and therefore things like 60-day fiance is something that is a norm. The last ditch effort that they have is, oh no, you're going to be jealous because everyone is jumping into one hot LA man to another, and therefore you're so jealous about it because now you're a trad wife. I think that on our side of the house, we don't necessarily limit people from being able to date. You're not stuck with one person. You can cut it off from the first step if you feel like they're not necessarily communicating well, they're pressuring you into things like sex. I think that is a better off alternative on our side of the house. But then, extension, even if we agree that you can get pressured into things like getting married or having children, and this, by the way, this is a very charitable thing, because obviously, like, not everyone will be forced into things like married immediately at 25. I think that the control is greater on our end. If both sides of the house experience pressure, like things like jealousy or things like pressuring narratives, I think on specific norms, we're still better. The trade-off then, on their side of the house, they must trade off things that you are consistently pressured to do things that other people like, which, by the way, is a norm in the Gen Z dating culture. Yeah, I'll take that PI. Sorry, through voice next time.
So it's about extents, right? So if you have pressure from your family, that is lessened over time because you're a Gen Z in a Gen Z environment. But you will always have the pressure to stay in a traditional structure on your side if you want to get the benefits of validation or the benefits of order and stability. You can't just cut them off when you're like 1 year into the marriage because you're no longer on the path, right?
Okay, you're only jumping to marriage. You're not talking about how you can cut it off if you don't like the physical intimacy that you have. You're only doing the worst case that they're already married. On your side, that also exists, by the way, because you're okay with people jumping into marriages. So I'm not quite sure what the delta is if we're talking about people who just get married instantaneously, because that also happens on your side. Extension. I think number one, you're likely going to be like worse off, given that you're pressured into having sex before you're ready, disproportionately affecting women, by the way, and submissive and shy like personalities. The second thing is that you're often than not create a lot of frequency when you are experiencing people that are not putting a label of your relationship, even if you want it to be a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Why is being pressured in towards things like marriage is something that is easier to navigate towards? To one, it's easier to reject the massive conservative ideals, like be a baby machine, on that PM tries to like using PM same characterization that you're a progressive, versus liberal ideas on open relationships, on polyamory, on things like open relationships that have little to no opposition for your own generation. So it's harder to navigate on your end. The second thing is that ideals on marriages have changed over time for our generation. Things like children, most often than not, if you're pressured to have children, a lot of them opt into things like adopting instead of giving birth. Gay people are also fighting for things like gay marriage and opting into things like IVF. The generation who stop at marriage, also still people that exist. They can't, given the fact that they can't necessarily afford a child economically. I think statistically, Gen Z got married later on. So if the marriage rate is at 18 years old, right now the average is already at 28. So people who follow this escalator guideline also got married later on and made better choices in the long term, which is a much more better comparative in contrast to their side of the house, where everyone is just confused and frustrated with the types of relationships that they have. Thanks.
Thank you for that fine speech, DLO. Now let's call on Governor. Here.
Hello, am I seen and heard?
Yes, you are.
Where's my phone?
You want the
Yeah.
timer? Yeah.
PY's through voice. Start in 3, 2, 1. The false dichotomy opposition tries to peddle to you is simply unrealistic. They say that the true clash of this debate lies in the opting into Gen Z culture that is toxic instead of waiting, which is apparently what they defend. 3 responses to clarify the burden and the true clash of this debate. The first thing that I want to note is that a lot of the mechanisms they point out and posit as to why people rush into relationships exist regardless and exist whether or not this person deviates or don't. Note, this isn't a debate about whether or not you want to opt into toxic notions of Gen Z dating culture or if you don't want to, but rather, would you deviate from the relationship escalator or would you not? Meaning that the difference is about how each model manifests in the same way that it does on status quo. Because most of your love interests on either side, even under their side, deviate too and meet you in the same hyper-fast social media system that push you together, operate within the same system of patriarchy and also pressure that push you to be married to each other. The difference is on extents. The second thing that I want to note is that it's about the timeline, i.e. it isn't fully having sex for it's like certain time slice. It's about the extents as what everything in debate and reality does. And what we point out is that it's what happens at these specific inflection points. When you're already living in, it's their side that must defend spending time, effort, and money in order to be able to get married. It's their side that must defend having sex before getting married in the first place. They assert that in the vast majority of instances, it's us that's forcing people into sex, when it's the optionality that allows you to deviate from this standardization that allows for more optionality since we don't know who this person is. But third, it's about control as to how this narrative manifests. They can say and try as they want to say that, well, it's much easier to resist like right-wing and alt-right notions of how this ought manifests, but oftentimes it's baked into very reality in ways that you don't understand. It's the sorts of lessons that are taught to you without citing things like the Bible. The fact that you were taught that marriage must be important in this way, that in the vast majority of instances, getting a divorce within them because you aren't sexually satisfied is a means of being sinful, means that in the vast majority of instances, it is still true that right-wing and patriarchal oppositions and institutions who had literal eons and decades to be able to cultivate what this means have a large hold over how you perceive these relationships in the first place, which means that on comparative, it gets far better in general. What this means is that the biggest contingency of their case, which is believing that it's either you opt into these relationships fast or don't, falls to the assumption, falls on that assumption. The question then is, where do these relationships get better en masse? The first thing that they say, and this is what I want to flag clearly, is that you will be pressured into having sex when it literally isn't just opting into physical intimacy in the first place. We'd point out that it's actually on our side where the deviation allows for some sort of semblance for allowing people to not have sex as much insofar as you create those boundaries in general, which is why it's on our side where you actually allow people to get in, live in together without the added option of sex, which is exactly what Nessie opts into. If anything, I'd flip this and explain that people are more pressured into sex in the first place on their side because they see it as the prerequisite to all of the other things within the relationship escalator, but also see these things as principally important insofar as that's what you as a Gen Z individual choose to opt into. But secondly, in the vast majority of instances, it's also about how these things manifest within each other, i.e. are you more pressured into having sex and into these power dynamics at the point at which you deviate from it or allow yourself that optionality, or when you're strict within a relationship? And what I'd point out is that any given relationship has power dynamics, but the ability for you to be able to deviate away from those that are important or deviate away from those that grant you the most or like the most weak position, i.e. opting out of marriage in the first place because you don't want to mix your finances, or opting out of sex because you feel it disempowers you, only exists in a world where you feel as if you have the optionality to opt out. Note, you don't know what this person wants. You don't know whether or not this person is going to like be absolute sex slave or whatever, or if this person wants whatever a marriage gives you, which is why the optionality that we explained to you offers and caters to most instances in which this debate is important. The next thing they say is, well, Gen Z dating culture is toxic. Never mind the fact that Gen Z dating culture will be toxic on either side of the debate. It's also about how you interact with your own experiences themselves. They say no, but you've also probably already been cheated on and you live in a culture that consumes many of these things. But the problem is, it's about the way up of what you can do in order to be able to gird yourself from those things, since you never have the assurance of whether or not somebody is toxic or not. And we'd explain that being able to opt out of a relationship at any slice of the pie, whether or not it's having emotional compatibility or physical compatibility first, is not a decision that opposition gets to make. That is a personal decision that is only up to you whether or not you're willing to cut it off at that point or willing to cut it off at the emotional side. And they never get the optionality. On our side, you have people from all walks of life, and especially this person, since you don't know how they are, they're able to opt out at those different time slides, and since it's catered to what specifically they want. The last thing that I want to respond to is they say this escalator really manifests in this way without giving any structural analysis for what they do. If you look at your notes, when their first speaker says escalators actually manifest in this way, they list down a bevy of impacts instead of actually proving this necessarily. When we tell you from Nessie that oftentimes there's a dominance of right-wing conservatism as well as implicit structures that condition as to how it works in the first place. Before I go on, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. This is all debate winning for a few reasons. The first is we explain optionality. The ability to edit relationships in ways that are conducive to your relationship only exists under our side. And this is crucial because the false dichotomy that they posit and lie to you, like straight up lie to you about, is literally the only win condition they win to this debate. If they pivot to this on op-whip, you already know that that lie is real. But secondly, it's also the case that your ability to be able to cater to what your preferences are is literally the most underpinning and important analysis within this debate, insofar as it's what enables you to be happy in the vast majority of instances. Last, they say that you are going to be lonely insofar as you aren't going to be happy, you're not going to be able to create connections with people in the ways that you do. But what we'd point out is that preferences can often change. Perhaps as a Gen Z person, you don't want to create emotional connections now, as what happens with most people. You just want to have fun in college up until you're 29. And we'd say that is a valid thing to explain, and that is a valid thing that you want to pursue, insofar as this is something that you, with your real preferences, want to do. They can't just assert that that's bad. In the vast majority of instances, these people are adults and can decide what they can do. But importantly, when these things change and when you're able to opt out and even opt into certain parts of that relationship that deviate, is when you're able to edit it around the people you actually like. Maybe they aren't ready for marriage. Maybe they don't want kids. But opting into a system that forces you to opt into the vast majority of these things renders you no capability of being happy in these scenarios. On all accounts, we win not because we are the most true to the reality, but we don't lie and rely on false dichotomies and dirty tactics to try and win this debate. For these reasons, propose.
Thank you for that fine speech, Govip, and let's call on up. Here.
POI through voice.
Hold up. Nessie went to the bathroom. Can we wait for a bit?
Like
Okay.
30 seconds, probably.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, she's back. Thanks for waiting.
Okay. Hello. Okay. For POI, say it through voice and just say it once. Three, two, one, go. If government wants to talk about false dichotomies, I don't think we're the team to talk about it. Because government's case rely on a model where if you opt out or opt in to the escalator, you're likely going to be right-wing and you're going to be influenced by this right-wing stuff because it's been built on decades. Check your notes. What is this influence of the right-wing? What will they make you do? Will they make you a trad wife? Will you become a trad wife? I don't know what the hell these harms are in the first place. Number two, if It is true on government side, you can opt out of the escalator. You are progressive. I presume you also have the same ability on opposition side to get out of this certain stuff. The fact is, if we are still Gen Z and we have the capacity to do so, I think on our side, we have the ability to do so. If government's frame relies on us being brainwashed by if we opt into this, we're gonna be a little bit more right-wing. I don't think it's a dichotomy of the debate. So the point is, the only debate is, do we opt into the escalator or not whether are we gonna lose our progressive values at the end of the day. We still have those because we're still Gen Z. They did not prove that just because you are in an escalator, you become a trad wife, a right-wing person. The first thing is, which side explores more? And I want to note this really, really badly because government keeps saying they have optionality on their side. There's two ways we deal with. Sure, POI.
So the problem here is that it's not that we're explaining how people get more trad, but the expectations on what you do at each step are more likely to be influenced by right-wing media. This is a straw man of our case. This is a lie.
Can government side get out of the expectations? Yes. Can opposition also get out of the expectations? Yes, because we're still a Gen Z. Why are you assuming we can get out of expectations? No analysis to prove why we are locked into that specific one. So, which side explores more? I want to note, we still have optionality on our side too, because we get to choose and pick and choose our partners. If in some way it goes wrong in the escalator, let's do the escalator again. If somehow you're a you have a midlife crisis, then do the escalator again. We prove to you that you still have the capacity to pick and choose people on our side. They didn't say why that's exclusive. Next, secondly, this is more damaging because government says their alternative is anything and everything. You can jump to marriage. You can jump to something else. I want to note that the alternative, half of it is you stay on the first level, half of it is you jump to the last level. So if you jump already to kids without marriage, or if you jump already to marriage, they do not get optionality. That means all of their impacts are literally halved in this debate. That means it is far more likely that you get optionality on our side because you guarantee that you go through that first step of getting to know people first and getting to know their values first versus on their side where it is anything and everything and you can jump through it. So even on their own debate and their own mechanism, we win it so hardly. The second issue is, where do we get stability? They just said you're going to be locked in, you're going to be pressured to marry this person because of patriarchy and the like. How did they say that they are immune to this in government? They said, because you are a Gen Z in a Gen Z environment, the pressure is lower. Guys, we're still Gen Z. We're probably still gonna marry Gen Z people. Our friends are still gonna be Gen Z. Just because you choose a specific way of getting a relationship does not mean you forget yourself. You become an ultra right-wing conservative. Even if it's not to that worst extent, you will still be the same person as you are. You are just choosing a relationship. So, government's mechanism of being in a Gen Z relationship or in Gen Z environment, being absolved the pressure, literally exists on opposition side too. You have the autonomy. Literally, we are the actor and we are choosing that. The second thing they said is about getting jealous. We say already, number one, if it's something so bad, then get out of the relationship, redo it again.
POI.
Number two, I think you're more likely to be jealous on government side because you are not rooted in stability. You don't know who you are. You don't know what your spouse is. You don't know who these people, what you actually want. At the very least, on our side, you are secure that there is someone back home that will love you. You are secure that this is who you are. This is who you've been. You're more likely to be jealous on their side when you're used to changing and flipping partners and ensuring that you do whatever you want. Lastly, let's compare the jealousy. Because government seems to think that jealousy happens when you see a person that has a hot wife. But we reckon jealousy happens far, far more when you see a person of your same age getting married and having kids. And I think the vast majority of people in the world get married and have kids. So if we're talking about the jealousy harm, it's more likely that you get jealous from kids and having husbands over a random person getting a hot wife. I am even not sure why it is so likely, what is such a big harm, or why is it so big. We flip that jealousy harm on their side. We say, at the very least on our side, we are rooted in something. Next, let's flip. Stability versus exploration. The first thing is, they just say optionality, but they need to prove what optionality leads to. Because optionality and exploration is just a means towards an end and you do not know the end, opposition tells you that most of the endings or the outcomes of this optionality is bad to begin with. Number two, if it's infinite options too, we say it's also infinite harms. The situationships that you have, the 29-year-old that's still enjoying in college while their other person, for example, their friends are getting married already. The second thing is, if we cannot assume what the actor is, as GovWhip said, then let's play the numbers game. What do most people like in the world? Is it the ability to go through many hookups and go through explorations versus having a wife, having a person that is stable, building a career around them and so on? I reckon the vast majority of people are more likely attuned to our side by virtue of the world literally being the way it is right now. We win even if you get their full extent of optionality. We don't even know if it's a benefit because it's merely a mechanism. The last is where you get a better career. At best, they just said marriage is expensive. We flip it and just saying having rent as a lone person is way more expensive. This is why people get married. And it's just an upfront cost. Furthermore, our material suggests that if you are stable, you are more likely to focus on your work. You are more likely to be able to continue. You are able to find a partner that is aligned with your values to achieve your career goals. If you're a doctor, find another doctor that's the same as you, so you have the same schedules and the like. Which means for the person, we're just better off for their career in comparison to government side, where they constantly have to find and switch and get exhausted at a time where they should be settling down. So it's very clear. Number one, we are still us. We are not going to be really influenced because we're still choosing. Number two, I think exploration, if they say it's so big, it's better on our side because the alternative is literally anything and everything. We even clarified this. The third thing is, even if you give them that, stability is just far better for more people, for a career, and for everyone else. Thanks.
Thank you for that fine speech, Opwit. But let's go on to Opera Plan. You're here.
Hello, I'll just set up my time. Can I borrow time? Okay. Or Ichi? Sige, sige. Okay. 3, 2, 1. When AdScore made us a motion, what do you think was the more intended rationale and clash? Is it that we have to debate rejecting or supporting immediate marriages and becoming trad wives, which government thinks that debate should be about? Or is it more likely that the priority is to whether or not we should emotionally focus on establishing that trust by getting to know each other first, and then progressing throughout that escalator as a prerequisite to other things like sex or physical intimacy, versus starting with any step of the escalator, doing anything, anytime, anywhere? Why is this so bad? Because I'd like to point out that the vast majority of the illustrations that come from the government is, oh, we're gonna get immediately married, we're gonna get locked in, we're going to regret the rest of our lives, like this is a chaperone song, for example. Why is such a bad comparative at the end of the day? Number one, understand that we have specific mechanisms, specifically from my deputy, that talk about how statistically the vast majority of people from Gen Z are likely to get married at 28. They are rational enough to know that getting married early is expensive. They aren't likely. But number two, OP also shafts this with their own mechanisms. They also try to say that in relation to the pressure POI that I put onto them, they were like, oh no, you still probably have other Gen Z influences around you. And as Ichiro points out, a lot of these pressure mechanisms is likely to be symmetric at the end of the day, which means that harm isn't as big as they want to overblow it, right? So there are two main specific justifications for why I think opposition should clearly win this round. Number one, on the true comparative, because Ichiro was right. The debate and the motion is specified and focused on whether or not the escalator in its entirety is something that the actor, because this is still an actor motion, is this something that the actor would want to do in the first place? The vast majority of the claims coming from us in relation to the incentives of the actor was left unresponded to. Because when Whip tries to say that, oh, let them have fun, they want to have fun, What fun! Heartbreaks, insecurities, pressures for things like sex, things like confused labels because you don't know what the situationship or where is it going to go. No, that isn't fun. And we tell you, when you focus on that escalator, when you get time to know that person through the emotional trusting phase, that's when you get your expectations correctly. What you expect in this relationship. Should we continue it or should we not? Should I go into a different escalator? They can call it dirty. I tell you that if it's going to be dirty, that's because we are the most grounded in reality at the end of the day. And then also, in conclusion, that is the most important burden because it's still an actor motion. Next, on the clash and optionality, they try to say that no, you don't get options, you get locked in. Where are the illustrations here? Because understand that in their side of the house, they are forcing this specific actor to continue doing these types of things. So irregardless if, since they never responded to the context, the actor in of itself probably has been hurt by things like bad situationships, probably has heard stories of the toxicity of the current nature of Gen Z dating, they never tell you why in spite of that context, the actor will be like, oh, I don't care, maybe I get hurt, but it's just whatever. They don't really tell that, so they don't illustrate why optionality is that. In our side of the house, we get better optionality because the first step in it of itself is meant to survey your options better. That do I really want to continue these things, or should I find another person to start going on a little date with and then take my chances elsewhere, right? But next, I'm also going to tell you. I just want to point out just the invalidity of the vast majority of the responses, because one of the biggest pushes is like, oh, backlash and pressure and people are not gonna like you. Let's just vibe check this for a second. Millie Bobby Brown is a Gen Z person. She got married. We're Gen Z. Do we hate her now? No, because understand that the concept of backlash is reliant that your conception of the friends and your family's conception of this individual is solely focused on how they do relationships when they're in college, for example. But no, averagely, you're still a person. You probably have friends who like you for who you are, not just because of the terrible people you date. In fact, these friends probably stick with you despite you date terrible people because of this toxic dating culture. In conclusion, from the interest of an actor who has seen how terrible the dating culture is right now, this is the solution in opposition to deviate, and it's better. Thank you.
Thank you for that fine speech of reply. Now let's go on to Gov reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. They say that you need to get to know them so you can protect yourself better. Hanno, I want you to think about all the women today who have been cheated on by their husbands but stayed on that escalator, or all the women whose husbands have progressively started abusing them as these women grow more and more attached to them because this escalator gave them a false sense of security. And that really points out the first reason they lose, which is that they assume that taking your time to get to know someone means that they will not hurt you. And I'm sorry to say that reality is not that beautiful, and the assumption that time equals loving them enough to know what you're getting into is a blatant lie. If you look at the outside world, I'm sure you have friends whose mothers have been cheated on. It clearly is not the case. Let's deal with this right-wing bullshit they're trying to lie is apparently about our entire case. First of all, we can suggest that the ways in which this escalator is enforced and encouraged is tendency to be right-wing, because if you look at the first few words of the motion slide, it suggests that it comes from religious and patriarchal upbringings, which means that many of the ways in which you are encouraged to opt into this and live through this life are those that inherently are not very equivalent to that of your progressive experience. And we're going to talk more about that progressive characterization later. But even if you did it in a non-conservative way, Jello's analysis takes effect, because it's not about how trad or progressive you become, but how staying in the escalator means the only validation you can get is by subscribing to these structures around these choices, such as getting married, such as having kids, such as appeasing your family. This means that this Gen Z individual feels isolated because you don't have as much social support apart from your friends and family, and this massively harms your benefit. Your friends, because they are living a quite different life from you, the life that we suggest is fine in terms of deviating, but your family, because if you are that progressive, you are unlikely to make them very happy if, for example, you are gay, or if, for example, you do not want to become a trad wife, which means even if you do not become a trad wife and we're fine with that, it is the fact that you are isolated from these structures. Let's talk about opt-out. Regardless, fights and relationship issues exist on either world, but the question therefore is how you opt out. And what we explain very clearly is on our side, opt out means that breakups and non-traditional orders of relationships is regular and okay, which therefore means you create preferences. So one, it's easier for you to realize you do not want it because, as we explained, you have reference points because you have experienced other things, like for example being able to compare sexual partners and realizing you don't want bad sex for the rest of your life. But also, what it suggests, therefore, is that because you are more likely that you are in a non-traditional relationship that didn't have significant opportunity cost, it is in our world in which you do not feel the pain of feeling like you have missed out, and therefore do not build resentment in times where you feel like the marriage you opted into had fallen flat. In comparison to their side, where opt-out makes you feel terrible, because when you get cheated on, when your love fades on the escalator, it makes you feel like you failed the model of relationships and the stability that you promised to this person as well. Even if you could opt out after marriage and go on the escalator again, you are significantly disillusioned and have already paid for a marriage, already had children, are taking them away from a family that is united and that might give them more happiness and security. But finally, yes, we agree that the actor is probably hurt. But the fact of the matter is, if they are hurt in either world, they can make more, better decisions and have more reference points and information, which precisely explains why they should have the optionality to choose whether or not they want to have sex before they get to know this person, whether or not sexual compatibility is their, main priority. Because, by the way, they never really explain why sex in and of itself is just bad to have first. Finally, then, where is this person happy? Because I want to note that their best case is finding a wife and kids and finding that stability. But note that we never say you can't do that. In fact, we embrace it as an option. The question is the path you take to get there if you want it. And it's fine to have sex before you realize you love them, because that's something that allows you to therefore make a more informed decision. And note that they assume this escalator equals time, but nowhere in the info slide does it say that you have to take time between doses, so you can still have a 3-month marriage, which will still have all the harms they tried to suggest at depth.
Thank you for that fine speech, Gov Reply. Thank you for that beautiful debate. You may now cross the house. The judges and I will hop into Discord